Computer. Okay. So we are recording. Welcome, everybody. I am David Kramer. I'm director of the library here at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And we have the privilege of sponsoring a series of book talks of books of Jewish interest. And this is certainly one such. We're very, very happy, Professor Schiff, to have you here to discuss Professor Schiff's Guilt, your book translated to English. And I see Michael Wise. So let me just say that the American, or the English reading, I should say, not just American, but the English reading audience is really in your debt, in the debt of New Vessel Press, for taking on Israeli fiction, Hebrew fiction, and offering it in translation to the English reading audience. We've sponsored book talks, including your fiction before, and we look forward to doing it again. This is really an interesting, challenging book. It is, I can say, while I was reading it, I was just thoroughly engaged with the questions that were being provoked. It is about slavery and its legacy. It is about race and class and privilege, all of these very much current concerns, and with their particular twists and angles when it comes to the Israeli public, but not just. These are today universal concerns, as we all know. I will allow you, Agur, to offer an explanation of the plot of the book and to do some reading. But I just want to quote, because I think really captures it beautifully, a few words from the review that appeared in the Publishers Weekly, which described your book as a daring post-colonial satire. I don't know if that's how you intended it, but I will confess that as a reader, and when it comes to the push and pull between authors and readers, the readers win. So speaking as a reader, that is the way it felt to me, and I think it captures something very important about the book. The issues here are issues that are worth addressing and rethinking again and again, and so we are grateful to you for having written the book, and look forward to the way you frame those questions in connection to the novel. So please go ahead.
Well, most of my talk actually will be reading from the book, and we haven't mentioned the translator, the excellent translator Jessica Cohen. So that's we have to credit her for the excerpts that I will be reading for you. And first of all, thank you for attending this, everybody. Thank you for attending this this talk. And giving me the honor of your attention. A few days ago, Professor Kramer, and this is the opportunity to thank him for setting this event, asked me if I had any second thoughts about this talk. I said that I hadn't, but of course I had second thoughts. This event was scheduled months ago when no talented prophet or highly experienced clairvoyant, such as the one actually featured in my book, could have predicted the horrific events of October 7th and the violent war that ensued, and still raging as I'm talking to you now, a mere 200 kilometers down the road from here in Gaza. So when Professor Kramer invited me, the context was very simple and straightforward. A presentation of this satire about us, Western intellectuals, and our double standard relationship with the third world, and especially Africa, our relationship with history and in its different narratives, the legacy, as Professor Kramer mentioned, the legacy of slave trade, colonialism, and other topics. I considered my book, Professor Schiff's Guilt, as a more or less universal piece, one in which the word guilt referred to hypocrisy more than anything else, a political satire in which Jews, Israelis, Africans, Dutch, British, and Americans share an equal burden because they are all the end product, so to speak, of a common human history. Was I wrong all the way? With your permission, let me introduce the book, pretending that we are still in the previous era, before October 2023. And maybe by the end of this talk, we will be able to contemplate another guilt, new guilt, other guilts, guilts that my generation never knew or acknowledged before the October events. But let's start with the book as I knew it, or as I wrote it, as I send it to the world before all these horrific events happened. So anyway, some years ago, people started discussing in earnest the possibility of reparations for the descendants of the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. The idea, although perfectly logical, seemed quite far-fetched at the time. And so I asked myself, what would happen if somewhere, say in some obscure African country, a new law is passed, a law of adjudication slave traders, their accomplices and their beneficiaries, heirs and beneficiaries. And in my imagination, I formulated the law on the model of the law which was enacted in Israel in the 1950s, the beginning of the 50s, and was designed for the prosecution of Nazis and their accomplices. Like the idea of reparations, such law seemed far-fetched, but perfectly realistic. And what will happen, I asked myself, when this law becomes practice? Continuing this line of thought, I searched for a possible protagonist to be accused and tried under this revolutionary law. And eventually, surprise, I came to the conclusion that I myself can be the perfect first test case of this new law. But of course, I had to invent for myself an ancestor who was a slave trader. And then I shipped myself to this unknown West African country, where I made that Professor Schiff, who by now had become a kind of caricature, alter ego of myself, of the writer, where he, the protagonist, claimed the remnants of a ship that belonged to his ancestor, Clonimus Zelig Schiff, a millionaire slave trader. And from there, the story unfolded. Professor Schiff is arrested, imprisoned in a villa in luxurious conditions. He gives testimony about the life of his great-great-great-grandfather before a special tribunal. And in the meantime, he also becomes a celebrity in that African country, befriends the president, makes endless but amusing conversations about moral guilt and the legacy of colonialism with the special investigator. We'll hear some of these dialogues shortly. And recalls the story of his falling in love with a migrant worker named Lucile in Tel Aviv in the days before his trip to Africa. It's a humoristic satire in which the protagonist is forced to confront, under unexpected and absurd circumstances, the guilt bequeathed to him by his ancestor. So I want to read to you the beginning of the book. the beginning of the first chapter of the book. Just to, to settle you into the book, which I assume most of you actually read. But anyway, yes, it's true. My grandfather's grandfather's grandfather was a slave trader. I cannot deny it, nor do I see any point in obscuring this embarrassing fact. After all, I feel no affinity with this man who departed the world almost a century and a half before I entered it. And I trust you will believe me when I say that our genetic linkage arouses more than a shred of discomfort in me. Ladies and gentlemen, there are those who claim that the past always makes surprise appearances. Indeed, that is sometimes true. Except that what we have here is not a long-forgotten parking ticket that crops up out of nowhere and, if not paid with interest, of course, might result in your bank account being seized. Nor are we dealing with an old woman who stops you on the street and reminds you that she was the girl you were once madly in love with. No. The past I am being asked to submit to you, distinguished members of the special tribunal, is my family heritage, for good and for bad. And where it rears its head, I cannot pretend to be surprised, because I have known for years about my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Rijks Schiff, about his business affairs, the fortune he amassed, and his mysterious disappearance. I've read about him, I've written about him, I've dreamt about him. I even know what he looked like. In a portrait that hangs in the Suriname's Museum in Paramaribo, he stands upright and rigid, wearing a tricorn and a stern expression. He is flanked by his wife, Esperanza, her head covered with a snood, and although she is not beautiful, she certainly is, how can I put this, charismatic. In the background, a ship with billowing sails glides across a flat gray sea that glistens like a sheet of zinc. Then again, why should anyone care about the slave trader, about what the slave trader, who was my great-great-great-grandfather, looked like? As far as I'm concerned, you are entitled to think that Professor Schiff, namely I, am him, as long as you can maintain your judicial objectivity. Not that I doubt your integrity, distinguished members of the tribunal. Not at all. I trust you unequivocally. Okay. This is all translated by Jessica Cohen. I already mentioned her. Thank you, Jessica. She's not here tonight. She couldn't attend. The notion in the basis of Professor Schiff's guilt is as I said before, the ambivalent relationship we have with our past. Meaning, on the one hand, we all cherish the need to correct social injustices. On the other hand, we stand utterly helplessly in the face of solid historical facts, which, despite our naive and ridiculous ambition, we cannot alter or modify. We, the people of the present, are the result of cultural evolution, whether we admit it or not, and therefore the sins of our ancestors are imprinted in us, just like other genetic attributes. And this is my big argument with the cancel culture principles and culture appropriations and stuff like that. Let me read another passage, and this is the second conversation of the special investigator his name is George Abu Ajie. He's another alter ego of mine because all the conversations he has with Professor Schiff is actually a sort of inner dialogue that I had with myself when I read the book, when I wrote the book. And so let me find it. This is the book, by the way. Where are we? Yes, okay, here we are. A few days later, at their second meeting, the power cuts came up again. Professor Schiff asked if a generator could be installed at the villa. Abu Ajie said that maintenance issues and logistics were not in his purview, are not in the purview of the Attorney General's office, and that Schiff should bring it up with Major Adi. I can't listen to music properly, Professor Schiff lamented. Music, Abu Ajie repeated. His surprised tone tinged with a note of mockery. I can't live without music, especially when I'm working. I believe you told me in our last meeting how much you like the quiet. Yes, that's true. I very much enjoy the quiet. That is to say, the sounds inside the quiet, if you know what I mean. The birds, the cicadas. But when I'm working, when you are working, writing my book, Abu Ajie said nothing for a long time, then asked, and what kind of music are we talking about? Bach, said Professor Schiff. Ah, so that's your music, said Abu Ajie, nodding heavily. Bach, that's what you like to listen to. Are you familiar with the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, Your Honor? Asked Professor Schiff cautiously. It was not condescension, not at all. After all, he was in a foreign country, foreign and distant. He was allowed to assume that the tastes of the people he met, including George Abu Ajie, a graduate of the LSE in London, were different than his own. A little, said Abu Ajie, and Professor Schiff thought he saw a hint of a smile. Bach, Professor Schiff explained, is not just enjoyment, it is true sublimity. Sublimity? Sublimity, sometimes even elation. Elation? Abu Ajie repeated with a nod. In that case, allow me to turn your attention to an interesting fact, which is that Bach's music, which, as you say, gives rise to sublimity and elation, is an auxiliary product of the European economy of the 18th century. He paused for a moment to examine Professor Schiff's reaction. And was that economy not, in that period of time, primarily based on the labor of hundreds of thousands of African slaves? Professor Schiff swallowed. Yes, I suppose that would be fair to argue, he murmured awkwardly. Well then, Bach could not have composed his music were he not paid with money produced by slavery, could he? And naturally, he drank coffee with lots of sugar. Perhaps he also smoked a pipe. I admit I've never thought of that. What did you not think of? That a good musician requires coffee, sugar, and tobacco? Abu Ajie chuckled. And by the way, I'm not entirely sure that what his wig was made of. In the pictures, it looks like cotton wool. So there might also be cotton in the story. What are you actually trying to say, Mr. Abu Ajie? Professor Schiff asked tartly. that the legacy of European exploitation reaches every corner of refined taste, Abuadji barked. The sweat dripping from his forehead disclosed the effort this conversation was exacting. Fine, okay. And you have your own wonderful music. That's completely fine. I have a lot of respect for other cultures and other tastes. No, please don't condescend to me, Professor. There are people in Africa here and there who also listen to Bach, perhaps even to the famous coffee cantata. A smile appeared on his face and vanished quickly. And not just in Pretoria and Johannesburg, I'm talking about Black people in Black Africa, Negroes. He looked at Professor Schiff out of the corner of his eye, as if to secretly examine what effect the forbidden word was having. Negroes, he repeated, like me, for example. That's exactly the point, Professor Schiff exclaimed, sounding a little choked up. Bach belonged to all humanity, including Africa, including the Africans, like Leeuwenhoek's microscope, or like Newton's gravity. Yes, gravity. What would you do without it? Bravo, Professor. You bring up excellent examples. I must say, you would give your great-great-great-grandfather a run for his money with your racist patronizing. That was not at all my intention. Please believe me, Mr. Abuadji. But his startled tone divulged his defeat. I believe you, Special Investigator George Abuadji said, and crossed his arms across his chest. I certainly believe you. He wiped the sweat from his brow with his hand and then said wearily, and I'll see what I can do about that generator. So that was the conversation about Bach. I must tell you that when I finished writing Professor Schiff's Guilt and submitted the manuscript to my Israeli publisher, a social process that until then had been progressing steadily, but in relative modesty, perhaps unnoticed by the most of us, came to a noisy eruption. This explosive climax was the killing of George Floyd, an event which gave birth to the Black Lives Matter movement with its very influential and forceful presence. Heads started rolling. At this point, only heads of statues, of figures revered by previous generations, people who by today's standards were absolutely evil. By the way, not all statues. For instance, Bogdan Khmelnytsky is still presiding over Kiev. I'm sorry that I'm stating the obvious here. I just can't resist the temptation. But this is the point. History is always manipulated as if it is an advertising campaign, which is another topic that my book touches. And I want to read you what President Ayer tells Professor Schiff in the very last moment before his departure, in the middle of the night, after he's toppled in the coup d'etat. And this is referring to the past. He says, you know, Prof, I was president for 7 years, a relatively short term by African standards, by the way. And until you landed here, you and your grandfather's grandfather's grandfather, I did not understand how important the past is and what a useful resource it can be. A charge sheet, an excuse for failures, an existential reason. Anyway, as the Black Lives Matter movement gained momentum, I, with Professor Schiff's guilt, ready for the printing press, was astonished of being so relevant and fashionable for the first time in my career. But no, I haven't hit a jackpot. Mine was a Hebrew book, and the readers in Israel, my small potential readership, did not care about the revolution that was taking place across the sea. Israelis, my publisher declared, were far more interested in romance and diets than in colonialism. Sadly, she was absolutely right. Even Jewish slave traders, an interesting historical fact, albeit a marginal phenomenon, and slave trade in general was hardly ever discussed in Israel, not even the modern incarnation of the practice that had clear echoes in the context of migrant workers to Israel. And of course, I touch on this topic directly in the book through the character of Lucile. So I want to read to you the scene or part of the scene where Professor Schiff encounters for the first time Lucile Tete of Foucault, with whom he later falls in love. And this happens in the house of attorney Malchior, who owes Professor Schiff a lot of money. And Professor Schiff comes to this house to collect his debt. And this is what Malchior is saying to him. Listen, the good news is that I've decided to meet you halfway, and I should therefore like to offer you, as an act of goodwill and beyond the letter of the law, something else instead of money. He gestured at the woman who had since re-entered the room carrying a tray with a bottle of water and 3 glasses. Something of equal value, as they say. What? Professor Schiff asks feebly. What are you offering me? I don't understand. Hair, said attorney Malchior. His hand was still suspended in mid-air like the wing of an angel. I'm offering you hair. Lucile sat down at the angle on the armset of one of the chairs, crossed one leg over the other, and dangled a flip-flop from her toe. She slowly sipped her water, eyes closed, with the same intensity with which she had kissed the mezuzah before. Wait, Professor Schiff stammered. I'm not sure I understand. He realized that there must be some trick being played here, the nature of which he had yet to grasp. Hair? Exactly, confirmed the lawyer with a nod. Professor Schiff had all but given up on ever getting the $4,000 he was owed by Yoel Malchior and his partners. He was well aware of what everyone knows. Battles against lawyers always end in defeat, even when they end in victory. And yet, if he saw no chance of the debt being paid, why had he insisted on coming here and entering this house uninvited? To be humiliated in all likelihood. No, this was no trick. Malchior was simply making a mockery of him. Excellent joke, said Professor Schiff, and slowly applauded. Wonderful joke, astonishing, outstanding. Malchior looked at Lucile. Professor Schiff thinks you are funny, he said in English. No, that's not what I think, said Professor Schiff, and attempted to smile at her. He shook his head heavily and felt his brain rattling from side to side in his skull. Very well then, let's proceed, Schiff. This is not a negotiation. Take it or leave it. Malchior pulled the phone out of his pocket, glanced at it, and clucked his tongue. I don't have much time. I have to be in court in 40 minutes. Unbelievable. Are you seriously offering me a human being instead of the money you and your friends owe me? I admit that when you put it that way, it doesn't sound very good. But yes, the idea is that you will take this woman as a personal assistant in return for erasing our debt. But I need the money. I have bills to pay. Then let her work for you. Work for me, Professor Schiff shouted. How exactly? Should I have her develop scripts, screenplays for people like you who don't pay? Or perhaps she should write my next novel for me? Besides, the whole idea is crazy, utterly scandalous, and completely against the law. The volume of his voice made no impression on Melchior. What do you know about the law, Schiff? He asked dryly, and promptly answered, nothing, nothing whatsoever. So my publisher in Israel pointed out that nobody is interested in colonialism. And true, colonialism, really? What does this have to do with us, the Israelis, who have been busy settling in occupied territory for several decades? They're not interested in racism either. Racism, how is this issue relevant to us, a people who define themselves exclusively by its ethnic origins? Injustice? Well, the painful fact is that Israelis still find it difficult, in fact impossible, to see how the denial of the civil rights of millions of Palestinians is in any way related to the everyday bourgeois lives. Now, in Professor Schiff's guild, I assign Colonimus Schiff, the early 19th century slave trader, the satirical task of pointing out these contradictions that are so characteristics of 21st century Israel. So let me read a passage about this interesting slave trader, my ancestor, Colonimus Zelig Schiff, and you'll probably and then another the continuation of that, but let's start with this one. Yes, my grandfather's grandfather's grandfather, Colonimus Zelig Schiff, was a slave trader. I've briefly described to you his life up until his sudden and mysterious departure. Please be patient. We will get to that. It's a long story. What's important for me to mention now is that apart from being a slave trader, Colonimus Zelig Schiff was also a missionary, but not just any missionary, not another uncompromising, honest, naive, cruel representative of Christ, on the matter of which I need not say another word to you Africans, but a Jewish missionary. Schiff's guilt, then, is twofold. Not only did he abduct hundreds of people from Africa, enslave them, and deny them their rights, he also persuaded them to convert. It is true that, considering all his misdeeds, this one does not equal the other villainies attributed to him. Yet still, his insistence on converting his slaves to Judaism added insult to injury. Even if his intentions were pure, and the intentions of missionaries always are, of course, it was a despicable act, at least to my mind. Atheists like myself sometimes have trouble comprehending that for people of faith, religion is the soul itself. It is important to note that the conversion of Schiff's slaves was not coerced, but brought about solely through peaceable persuasion. However, even if Colonimus Schiff's business acumen, namely superlative salesmanship and charisma, was instrumental to his missionary project, the way he presented these miserable people with his preferred religion was not particularly sophisticated. I assume his winning line was, "Come and join us, a nation of liberated slaves." A deceptively simplistic sales pitch aimed at a target audience that would, in any case, have bought whatever product it felt a rapport with. In any case, the minute Schiff's slaves gave up their voodoo traditions and disavowed the pantheon of ghosts who managed their arduous lives, or alternatively dismissed the Holy Trinity from their jobs, some of the slaves had joined the Dutch Reformed Church by then and decided to convert to Judaism. They took upon themselves the whole folklore package offered by the ancient tribe that they were joining, from dress and accessories through national myth and messianic hallucinations, including, of course, a yearning for the Holy Land, namely Zion. I skip a bit, and you're surely familiar with the famous lines, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yeah, we wept when we remembered Zion." Of course, I knew you would be. Who isn't? I'm sure you also know that this well-known verse voices a central theme in the Jewish ethos, the yearning for Zion. Colonimus Schiff made a point of ensuring that each of his converts adopted this ethos, instilling a yearning for that mysterious swath of land, that magical, sweet, mythological destination where, and not in any other place on earth, all hopes would come true. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, not only did Colonimus turn his slaves into Jews, he also made them Zionists. Do you understand what happened here? Astonishingly, my ancestor was almost 50 years ahead of the Zionist movement. Admittedly, he was at the wrong time, in the wrong place, and with the wrong people. But in my opinion, he certainly deserves the title Herald of Zionism, even if there is no street named after him in Tel Aviv. And when he brings them finally to the shores of Africa, and he gives them a brief on the deck of the ship. So listen to this. Once they reached the bay and explored it, Schiff explained to his little congregation, they're all on the deck of the ship, and the shores of Africa are seen just in the horizon. So he says, they would find themselves a suitable, comfortable corner, and then with God's grace and probably some cash, the Dutch governor of this region would allocate a small area where they would be allowed to reside temporarily until they could build a permanent settlement. Missives had been sent to all relevant parties several months ago, and the reply from the Dutch governor, Commander Friedrich Franz Ulrich Last, had been received even before the Esperanza had set sail. At this point, Agur Schiff, who could barely stand up and whose complexion was now a pale shade of green, he suffers terribly from seasickness, retrieved an envelope from his jacket pocket. He took out a letter, unfolded it in the light breeze, and read it aloud to the small crowd swaying on the deck with him. Now listen to this. His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Dutch-administered African territory of a Jewish settlement and will use their best endeavor to facilitate the achievement of this object, and so on and so forth. And you obviously hear the echo of something in it. Let's move on. The main intention, or one of my main intentions in the book, was to expose the hypocrisy and self-righteousness of Westerners and their relations with the third world, and especially with Africa, which, despite being a continent with a huge diversity of peoples, cultures, languages, customs, music, art, is still a blurred area in the West's picture of the globe. There is plenty of phony soul-searching and fashionable anguish over the sins of the past, while, of course, completely ignoring the sins of the present. But the guilt in my book is mostly about hypocrisy, because guilt, in my opinion at least, whether private or collective, always covers bad intentions and some very nasty but inseparable elements of the human soul. I want to read you another conversation between George Abu Ajia and Professor Schiff, which is relevant to what I've just said. So here we are. Are you ready to admit your guilt, Professor? But I confessed long ago, said Professor Schiff. Did you really? Yes, I did. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was a slave trader. But that is not the accusation, Abu Ajia pointed out. I also confessed that I wanted to claim the ruins of the sunken ship and the relics found in it. No, this is also not the accusation. Then what is it? What? Why am I here if not because of your stupid law? Perhaps that is why you are here, yes, due to the law for adjudication, slave traders, and so forth. But as far as I'm concerned, that is not what you stand guilty of, Professor Schiff. Rather, it is the denial of Africa. The denial of Africa, Professor Schiff screeched. What are you talking about, Special Investigator Abu Ajia? I tell you what I'm talking about, Professor. Abu Ajia replied calmly. Africa does not exist in your world. It is merely a myth, a legend, an amusing anecdote. Me, us, the villa staff, the tribunal, the city, the country, the continent, we are all here to serve as background sets for Professor Schiff. That is the charge. No, I deny that, sir. I adamantly deny it. From the moment you began talking to me, to us, you have not stopped prattling on about the book you want to write, the book you were writing, the book you're about to write, while we feed you, protect you, and put on a show for you with our so very nice Africanness. Do you want to know about what I think about you, Africa? Maybe it really is time for me to stop fawning and tell the truth, Mr. Abu Ajie. Ah, interesting, Professor, very interesting. So what you've been doing up to now was just fawning. Interesting. But why? What did you think you would get out of it? Did you want the black man to like you as you like him? Yes, I want to be liked. And do you know why, Mr. Abu Ajie? Because you Africans have an insatiable appetite for pity, more and more and more pity. Go on, Professor, please go on. This conversation is finally getting interesting. Abu Ajie sat down on the stone bench in his normally impenetrable gaze. There was now a spark of provocation. Professor Schiff sat down opposite him on the ledge around the dried up ornamental pond. It is an appetite that can never be sated. This country longs for pity more than it longs for actual food. But perhaps the other side is also hungry. Do you understand what I'm saying, Professor? Professor, perhaps this whole relationship of humanity with Africa and of Africa with humanity is based on mutual appetite that cannot be sated. Like, for example, Africa's appetite for murderous weapons, suggests Professor Schiff, or the West appetite for black people, Abu Ajie countered. The appetite of rulers for money, said Professor Schiff. The world's appetite for metals, diamonds, oil, cobalt, uranium. Human beings' appetite for middle-class comforts, said Professor Schiff. For consumer goods. And of course, said Abu Ajie, the appetite of multinational corporations for contracts, bids, monopolies. The appetite of religions for souls, living or dead, said Professor Schiff. Preferably dead, because that way ownership is eternal. The West appetite for pure, naive, native cultures, said Abu Ajie, for photogenic poverty. The appetite for atonement, said Professor Schiff. The appetite for self-castigation. And the appetite for freedom, Abu Ajie added. Well, this is it. I think I've more or less presented the book effectively. But the truth is, I go back to the second thoughts I mentioned earlier. I didn't come here with much of an appetite for PR performance. It is much more important for me to share my thoughts about the new era. Maybe you'll help me to digest or indeed to comprehend my new place in the world after October 7th. So my thoughts. During one terrible day, I was expelled from my club, from the club of the enlightened, the fighters of darkness, the seekers of equality and justice. I was kicked out. I'm no longer entitled to my share of progressive Western democratic values. My ideas are no longer allowed to be voiced. The new guilt, the guilt, Professor Schiff's guilt, being an Israeli. Well, maybe I'm a bit cynical, but the feeling is very hard. And I tell you, I'm really shattered, like more or less everybody here. And it doesn't matter at all what opinions I've expressed over many years, that I opposed the occupation and its injustices, and I did everything I could to influence and bring change about. By the way, one of my novels entitled "What We Wish For," is solely dedicated to the occupation. So, you know, I pay my debt. And now, not only that my beloved intellectual cultural club canceled my membership, the claim that the atrocities committed against me, rape, beheadings, kidnapping, were a fair price to pay for my stupidity. But hey, such programs have already been carried out in us in the past. In the past, we were murdered before many times. Don't you agree? That's why we are here. I mean, here in Israel. Is it possible that being Jewish constitutes another guilt? And listen, I do not for one moment justify Israeli policy, and certainly not the insane attack on Gaza. I'm totally and unequivocally against it. In my opinion, it is a cruel and pointless act of revenge. But do these unjustified actions negate my existence and or my voice? And there is also one more point: Hebrew. It is clear that Hebrew, the language in which I think, feel, and dream, the only language I can use as a writer, this is very unfortunate, but it's a fact. Hebrew is a language that was resurrected in order to serve the new Jewish nationalism, and thus was used as a tool in the hands of Zionism. So yes, I'm a Hebrew writer, and that's another guilt. But did I have any choice? Okay, this is it, my friends. I've said everything I wanted. I can't hear you.
I just realized that I had to unmute. Thank you for your very, very powerful presentation. Um, I, I mean, you've asked so many questions, right? I mean, your book asks questions right now in the kind of the after chapter, what you just referenced now, you really asked a lot of very, very probing and difficult questions. I'm confident that we could take up any of these and go on literally for hours in an important conversation, because every single one of the questions that you've raised is extremely important. I'm afraid, though, that if we begin that conversation, we can't stop. Um, because how can you stop in
That's
the
very
midst of
true.
what?
That's very true. Yeah, we can stop here and, you know,
Okay,
leave
so
everybody with the questions. Most of the questions cannot be answered. I mean,
right,
I'm completely baffled. I'm completely puzzled. I don't know what's going on. I still really, I'm not completely comprehending and digesting the new situation. It will take time. It will take time.
yeah.
And after comprehending, it will take time to heal. It will take years. We can, you know, we can stop here with the questions, and you
No,
know.
I think that's right. I just want to, I have a question which you need not answer, right? But I want to raise the question, and you're welcome to answer it if you like. And then I just want to make one observation based upon something in the library, which is sponsoring this talk. So the question is, I'm sorry, I admit I didn't go back to the Hebrew. What's the Hebrew title is what?
אשמתו של פרופסור שיף.
Ashmato. Okay, so guilt is a direct translation of that.
Well, not really, because ashma in Hebrew is not as specific as guilt.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but yes,
Yeah.
it's
I mean,
it's a fair translation.
the reason I ask is because as you spoke, both in your discussion of the book and discussion for its implications for post October 7th, it occurred to me that as good as guilt might be the word shame, right? Which is not the same as Ashmad. I mean, Busha, right? They are related, but they're not the same, right? So would shame work there? Would embarrassment work there? I hear a little bit of those as well. So I invite a response to that. And then there's one actually observation I want to make. But what do you think?
I I think that you're relating to the post October 7th events, right?
No, actually before as well. In other words, what does one experience if one were in the position of having had an ancestor as a slave trader, being in the position of being offered a young woman migrant who's being exploited, and whether she agrees or not, it's going to
But
be against her will, right? How does one feel about that? Guilty?
but but
Ashamed, embarrassed? I think all of them work. So
but but don't you think that shame and embarrassment are, carries guilt with them, or the other way
Oh,
around?
yeah, no,
I
I
mean,
think
I
they're
mean,
related.
I
I
mean,
don't think it's either or.
I think guilt sort of, includes in it the shame and the
Hmm.
embarrassment and many other shades of, this uncomfortable feelings. But I think guilt, encompasses all.
Hmm.
I
Uh,
think the issue, Ashmato, he was blamed for
It
Ne'asham,
also is relates
Hebrew.
to blame, but right, that's a
To
very,
blame
very
is
good
nothing,
point.
is not is feel guilty, is not he's guilty. It's somebody blame him for doing something. That
Yes,
means
that's
it's
also
not his feeling, is somebody blame him.
right.
And this is the impression. By the way, something interesting. Back in 48, my grandfather have a good friend in Jaffa. We live in Tel Aviv. And his friend come to him one day and say, hey, you will be all dead. But if you want to serve your family, please give me all your business and your young daughter, my aunt.
Okay. Thank you for sharing
This
that.
it was practiced in 1948,
Yeah,
not many years ago.
not that many. Thank you for sharing that. So I mean, before I add an observation, I just want to say I think this is a book that people should engage and challenge themselves with. I am going to do my best. I have to tell you that I was on my way when I read the book. I was in Africa, actually, and on my
really?
way, yes, really, and on my way back to Amsterdam. And I'll add a little bit more about that in a moment, but I was just so totally enveloped by the experience and the book simultaneously. It really opened my eyes in ways that I didn't know that a book could. So I'm going to recommend the book to anybody I can. I am going to share the recording of this because, Agur, the way you approach this, what you chose to read, the comments you made are all challenging in the best sense of the term. And I think that more people who have an opportunity to be exposed to what you've created and what you've shared, it will be to their benefit. Folks know where to buy books these days. So whether you're here today with us live or you're watching this on recording, I encourage you to pick up the book and to take advantage of its deep thoughtfulness. Now, all I want to add, and then I'll let you have the last word, is as I said, I was reading the book when I was in Africa and then in Amsterdam and on the long plane ride between Africa and Amsterdam. Um, and in Amsterdam, I've got good friends, both of whom have association with the Anne Frank House. One of them, until he retired a couple of years ago, was the director of international outreach for the Anne Frank House. Very, very thoughtful, caring individuals, neither of them Jewish, as it happens. And they, the last time I visited with them, not on this trip, but before, um, they brought me and my wife to the Sephardi cemetery outside of Amsterdam, just outside of Amsterdam in Nieuwkerk, however it's pronounced. And there one will see beautiful Jewish headstones from the Sephardic community of the 17th century and onward. And by the side of some of those headstones, one will see the burials of their slaves. Right, because Jews living in Amsterdam did what others living in Amsterdam did. And we have gotten our collection here in the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary, a book that was printed in Hebrew and Spanish in Amsterdam in 1684, which includes a ceremony and brachot, blessings, that a Jew is supposed to recite upon acquisition of a slave. So this is not mere fiction. This, as you know, right, this is real serious history that raises real serious questions.
No, listen, I made some research. I mean, not I made everything up, but I made some research, and I studied Suriname at that period, and I studied, the relationship of Jews with slaves, and I know that Dutch Jews had a special relationship with their slaves, and they did convert them to Judaism.
Mm-hmm. They did indeed. That's right.
Yeah.
That's part of the ceremony, is a conversion ceremony. That's exactly right. Well, thank you. I mean, this is just really superb. I hope you won't mind if next time I'm coming to Israel, I get in touch in advance and we arrange to go out for coffee. Everyone who's here, thank you for joining us, and come back after the new year for more book talks sponsored by the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For this opportunity. Bye-bye.
Sure. Bye-bye, everybody.